Welcome to class. Go ahead and take your books and go to page number 481. Page number 481 in your books. Yesterday we spent time talking about expansion in largely expansion in the New World, expansion by the British in Canada, expansion of the U.S. into the American West, expansion as far as and I talked pretty glowingly about American expansion into the Louisiana Purchase, and I talked about it in terms of American exceptionalism. The American ideals that made the West. What we are getting into today is the extension of European power, the extension of power into areas that were problematic for Europe. Now, if you watch yesterday and today's lecture side by side, you might say, what has happened? Has he changed his opinion? No, I've not changed my opinion. The question then is, well, wait a minute. Why does Brother Seaford say that American exceptionalism, which is the American efforts to colonize the West, what makes that different than the European expansion in other areas of the world? Well, several reasons. First of all, we look at the ideas of American expansion out west. We talked about the Louisiana Purchase. The Louisiana Purchase, as I discussed yesterday, Thomas Jefferson, the president that made that purchase, he said that he stretched the Constitution so much that it cracked. Meaning he believed that the president didn't actually have the authority to make a land purchase without Congress. However, he was afraid that Napoleon in France would look for other buyers for the Louisiana Purchase if he didn't act fast. So despite the fact that Congress wasn't in session, he came up with a loophole that kind of allowed him to make the purchase while at the same time he lived the rest of his days kind of concerned about his choice because he felt that it was a drastic government overreach. Whether or not that was a drastic government overreach, we can discuss and argue about for a long time. But when you look at the Louisiana Purchase overall, the Louisiana Purchase was a legal purchase. It was a legal purchase, and the American nation had the right to push west. The second thing, not only the right of America to push west, but also the philosophy as to why people pushed west. Now, absolutely, people went out west with some people went out west with greed on their minds. A lot of people went out west to the gold rush. Now that would take place later in the 1840s, but regardless, there were people that wanted to go west for selfish reasons. But most of them didn't go west out of selfish reasons. Most of them went west because they wanted to have the opportunity to build a life for their families. They could be part of this American ideal. Not only that, there was a sense of independence as you went west. When they went west, they understood that they had to make it by themselves largely. There really was not government. There really wasn't law and order out west. And they knew that if they went, they were on their own. And so because they knew they were on their own, they were least likely to get into scrapes with other people, because if they got into trouble, then they don't have the government to rely upon. And so a very conservative philosophy pushed pioneers west. And absolutely, despite all of this, absolutely, there was sketchy things that took place. One of the greatest examples of government overreach when it came to going west was the Trail of Tears, and that wouldn't take place until Andrew Jackson. But Andrew Jackson would sign a bill after having basically rammed it through Congress. He ordered that all Indians in the 13 states, he ordered them to go out west into what's now not only the Louisiana Purchase, but also into what was controlled by Mexico and the Texas annexation. He ordered all of those Mexicans moved, and then did not provide them with enough supplies to outfit their journey, so many people died. That is an example of huge government overreach. I am not making it sound like there were no problems with the American expansion out west. There was problems, especially wherein the government overreached. The government should have just left the Indians where they were, at least the peaceful ones. The Indians that chose to fight, then, that's the way things go. If they want to raise their hand against the United States government, then then the people of the United States have the right to defend themselves against aggressors. But the Indians that were not, that weren't fighting, that weren't causing a lot of hay, the government overreached and forced them to go west against their will. That's a huge example of big government getting out of hand. So I don't mean to say that there wasn't negatives that came along with expansionism, but American exceptionalism, American expansion, was largely based off of the ideas and principle of liberty. That is the liberty to prepare a life for yourself, to let the government to keep the government kind of relatively out of your hair, to provide for your family. That's a very conservative philosophy. But when you get into European extension, which we're talking about today on page number 481, we're contrasting the American exceptionalism that we talked about yesterday to the European overreach on page number 481 and following. So, American exceptionalism, though of course you can point to negative effects of expansion, but overall, the American exceptionalism, American expansion, was based off of conservative ideals of liberty and freedom. The European overreach had more to do with colonizing other nations. And when we look at this, we see some very, very important differences between the European expansion and the American expansion. The quest for colonies in the 16th and 17th centuries was motivated primarily by the economic policy of mercantilism. Okay, so what is this mercantilism? Well, let's get started in our slides today. Okay, mercantilism is the belief that trade generates wealth, otherwise known as commercialism. When you go to the store, or at least when you went to the store before this whole coronavirus thing, when you went to the store and you bought a movie, you bought a book, you bought food, that is trade. You are trading something of value for something of equal value. You are trading that currency. You are trading that little certificate that you have in your wallet. That's a $20 bill. You're trading that for something of equal or lesser value. And that's basic economics. Well, what happens is Europe decided that they were going to expand, and these European countries, they looked upon their colonial possessions as a source of great wealth. So let's go back to England here for a second. England had colonies all over the world. England had colonies in Canada. They had colonies in Africa. They had colonies in Asia. These colonies were looked upon by the British Crown as a source of wealth. And so they realized they could use these colonies to expand their wealth. They wanted to control more. They wanted to control more money. They wanted to control more power. And They viewed it as a great engine for getting more money. But the irony is, the catch-22 of the European expansion is that they looked at colonization opportunities overseas. But guess what? In mining all of the money and the wealth from these colonies, they're also draining their own nation's finances to maintain and protect those colonies. So let's just use England and India, for example. Let's just say one of the cash, let's just say you get a lot of income from India based on, I know nothing about India's revenue, but let's just say you get a lot of you get a lot of diamonds or something. I don't know. Let's not make it India. Let's make it Africa. Let's just say that they see in South Africa, one of their colonies, the capability of gaining wealth by colonizing South Africa. So they invest in colonizing South Africa. What's the problem, though? They also have to spend a lot of money to colonize and then to protect and maintain these colonies. So many would argue, was the colonies even worth it? Some could argue. But anyway, when you look at English expansion and European expansion in the world, it was due more based off of a overreach of government. Government wanting to control much more revenue. And part of this also was a way to provide revenue for the Industrial Revolution. We'll discuss that in a few minutes. But mercantilism, the belief that trade generates wealth, pushed these European colonies to look to other nations or other colonies as a means of getting wealth, while at the same time draining the nation's finances while trying to colonize. But this is known as imperialism. Imperialism is the extension of power by one people or country over another country. Now, you go out in this world, and the left especially will talk about imperialism in terms of being racist. They will talk about imperialism as how, imperialism, the imperialism of Europe, the imperialism of America, it can never be made up for. The negative things that England did while colonizing these other places, those sins cannot be erased. And that these original nations were racist. It was because the English people were racist that they wanted to colonize South Africa. That's not it at all. Don't let the left tell you that the expansion of influence over colonies was an example of racism. Now listen, if you haven't, maybe you've not been able to tell so far, I'm a small government guy. I'm a small government conservative. One of the reasons why I think American exceptionalism, American expansion out west was so glorious. Glorious is not a good word. That's over glorifying it. But the greatness of American expansion and American exceptionalism was due to the fact that those people could go west and have less interference from the government. My love for the American West, for the American expansion, for the American expansion, is due to the fact that people can have less, can rely less upon government and more upon their own character. What you look at in England and what England was doing in their expansion, they were trying to expand their central government by providing places, by creating colonies that would provide revenue for the crown. In the U.S., the purpose of expansion was to provide an opportunity for people to get out of government's way. It's the exact opposite. When Europe expanded, the European monarchs tried to actually expand direct control. They wanted more control. It's completely opposite of small government conservative, big government liberal. So I have my problems with European expansion, but it has nothing to do with racism. Racism was not a factor here. Now, I'm not saying there weren't racists back then. Of course there were racists back then. There's always going to be racists. There'll be racists from now until the end of time, because that is the result of a fall. And we as believers need to be ready to combat it whenever we see it. But imperialism by itself, in the European imperialism, was not due to racism. Again, I'm a small government conservative. I have my problem with large government expansion over other nations and over colonies, because I think that the greatest type of government is a small government. And the governments of these European monarchies, guess what? They were big government. They wanted to expand control. This was my problem with European expansion. That being said, like I said, a lot of the left tries to paint the reasons for imperialism as racism and all these things. Let's look at the real reasons for imperialism. After my having said my problems with European expansionism, let's look at the reasons for expansionism or imperialism proper. Now, one of the first reason for imperialism was the expansion of industrialism increased the demand for raw materials and new markets. That's what I said. The catch-22 of this whole situation is this. They wanted the opportunity to trade more. They wanted the opportunity to increase their own revenue from these raw materials and these new markets. But guess what? They're also having to expend a lot of money in order to open up these trade routes and open up these new markets, and to mine these nations, these colonies, of their natural and raw resources. So, it's kind of a question. You can argue how effective was imperialism. You can argue that it turned out to be more expensive than it was worth. You can argue that. Another reason for imperialism was nationalism. And again, the left tries to paint nationalism in itself as evil. Nationalism isn't evil unless you are talking in terms of the nationalism wherein the government increases control and brings harm against other people, like we have in Nazi Germany. That they were the National Socialist Party. They loved their country, but they were also socialist. They also thought other races to be inferior. And guess what? No amount of love for country can erase the stain of their own overreach in murdering 6 million Jews, 4 million other, I think 4 million of their own German people. Not enough. There's not enough nationalism that can erase those sins. Again, we're not comparing the British Empire in this age to Nazi Germany. We're not making that comparison. What we're saying, we're trying to delineate between pure nationalism, which is just a love for country, and the nationalism that's filtered through a maleficent filter. And the last thing here the third thing here really is humanitarianism. And see, this is where I go back to. I have my problems with European expansionism because it was an increase in government. These European nations expanded control, while in the American West, while we were expanding, government was less of an issue. People went west to kind of escape the government control. So I have my problems with British and European expansion. However, and again, the left likes to try to paint the entire European imperialism as something racist. That could not be any further from the truth. Look at this. Part of the reason that Europeans felt the need to expand was to correct horrible wrongs that were being done across the world. They launched sincere efforts to improve education, abolish slavery, and stamp out disease and famine in colonial territories. The left tries to demonize imperialism because of their overreach. However, it was these imperialist nations that desired to abolish slavery. The left likes to look at European imperialism and say, well, they were racist. Really? They were trying to abolish slavery, you lug nut? Try to ponder that for a second here. See if they were racist, then they were horrible racists. Okay, and the final reason for imperialism was the expansion of Christian missions. On page number 483, you see a facet on William Carey in India. He was alive during this imperialist age, and he saw this as an opportunity to reach India for Christ. Let's look at some of these individual regions of imperialism. The first one is Asia, but we're gonna break down what Asian imperialism or European imperialism in Asia looked like. Let's look at the first one, India. So, India was very quickly absorbed into the British Empire. What happened was there was a trade company, a company that focused on trade in Britain. It was called the East India Company. If you've seen Pirates of the Caribbean 2 through, I don't know how many they're on, 19 now, something like that, you always hear the East India Company, the East India Trading Company. They always talk about the East India Trading Company. They added, when they made the movie, they added trading in the name because otherwise people wouldn't know, well, what's this East India Company do? Its real name was the East India Company, but it was a trading company, so they just put trade in the name for the movie purposes. But the East India Trading Company was able to get their foot in the door in India and start opening it up for trade. But before long, political unrest in India allowed for the East India Company to basically be an arm of the British government. And the East India Company basically was the British arm of control in India. And this would cause problems because now India is essentially assumed into the British Empire, and these Indian people wanted freedom. And these Indians that also wanted freedom, they looked around and they realized that Britain was having a bit of a time with their old rival France. This takes place during the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War. India looks around and sees the British fighting the French, and the French have influences in India, so they go to the French and they say, listen, we'll fight with you if you'll help us get rid of the British. And the French were all but willing to agree to that bargain. And an Indian prince sided with the French in an attempt to overthrow the British rule of India, and the Indians and the French lost. And the British retained control of India for many years. But remember, as long as we're talking about India, remember how I talked about one of the reasons for imperialism being humanitarian? England and other nations wanted to improve education, abolish slavery, and stamp out disease and famine in colonial territories. They wanted to try to make those lands better. One of these, this is a good example of that reason. The British come to India and they see a horrible practice that takes place in the Indian colonies. What happens is, according to Indian cultures, ladies, if you are an Indian woman and you get married and your husband dies before you do, they would cremate his body. So you get dressed up for the funeral. They cremate his body. You stand there, watching your husband's body burn. And then, you know what's coming. It is now, according to Indian custom, it is your duty as the widow of this dead man to walk up a platform in front of the fire and then hurl yourself onto the flaming embers of your husband's burning body, and it was your duty to burn yourself alive, kill yourself, because your husband has now died. You are a widow. In fact, in some cases, if you just got engaged and your fiance dies before you even get married, sometimes you were still expected to hurl yourself off of into the fire of your fiance's funeral pyre. This was a horrible practice that took place for hundreds of years in India. And the British come, and the British see this as a horrible practice. And so they work tirelessly for years to see this monstrosity of a tradition outlawed. And eventually, this was outlawed. So people who talk about the evil imperialism of Europe, just remind them that some good things did come out of it. Now, also, skipping forward. We look at China. Imperialism in China took an interesting turn. China and Japan, those northern Asian countries, were kind of the last countries on Earth to kind of open up to the West. Very few people knew about what went on within the borders of China, within the borders of Mongolia, what happened on the island of Japan, on the peninsula of Korea, the Korean peninsula. Very few people knew what was going on there because those were closed countries. Just as a basic rule in world history, Asian countries are very, very tight-knit, and they don't open up easily to the outside world. It's kind of like the Shire in Lord of the Rings. They're just kind of, we're going to stay over here. We don't want to know what the outside world is. It's scary out there. We want just to kind of keep ourselves. That's basically what China, Japan, and Korea had become. Well, the Manchu dynasty was a long-running dynasty of dynastic rulers, and they had ruled China since 1644. And then, in the 1840s, so about 200 years later, Britain begins to seek to open trade with China, because again, China's a closed country. And for years, Chinese rulers had done nothing to stop British traders who... hold on, I'm backing up here. By the 19th century, internal problems had crippled the Manchu leadership. China's growing weakness prompted Western nations to seek greater trade privileges. Chinese attempts to restrict foreign trade led to war between China and Great Britain. For years, Chinese rulers had done nothing to stop British traders who smuggled opium, which is a dangerous drug, into China in return for tea and silks. When Chinese officials finally sought to put a stop to this drug trade, British merchants objected. See, what happened was Britain brought opium into China as a way of trying to open up trade. The Europeans had been coming to China and saying, hey, China, will you trade with us? Will you trade with us? Will you trade with us? And China kept saying, no, we don't trade with outsiders. And finally, the British got an idea. Why don't we get them addicted to drugs? And then once we've gotten them addicted, they'll know the only place they can get the drugs from is us, and this will open up a line of trade with China when we can trade with them this opium. And so that's what Britain did. They started trading opium with the Chinese as a way to try to open up the country to other types of trade. And then what they did was they wanted to try to put the screws to China, wanted them to actually feel the pain when they stopped trading. So Britain then said, you know what, we're going to start doing a little bit stricter, I can't speak. We're going to put a little bit more pressure on the Chinese when it comes to opium. And the Chinese government, under the Manchus, they began to see what opium was doing to their people. Again, Asian countries are very tight-knit countries, and they're countries with a great work ethic. And the Chinese, the Manchu dynasty, looked around and they noticed that the culture of China was being horrendously hurt by this opium, because the work ethic that they had been teaching their children for years was now falling to pieces. People weren't wanting to work, they were just wanting to binge on opium. And this was causing real cultural struggles for China. So then the Manchus decided, okay, we are going to stop trading opium with you. Well, now Britain doesn't want to lose their one inroad into China. So then Britain goes to war with the Chinese, excuse me, to the Chinese over opium. And China lost. And the one thing that China had wanted to gain from this war, China wanted to win this war and so gain the opportunity to restrict trade to Britain. And Britain won. And so Britain said, okay, as a result of you losing the war, we are going to force you to open your borders to trade. Then what they had was the Sino-Japanese War. Now, Sino means Japan. It's just a different way of saying it. And the Sino-Japanese War was fought between China and Japan. Guys, I don't know why I'm yawning so much. It's not that late in the evening. And guess what? The Chinese lost this war, which resulted in even more trade concessions. So China's not really doing good here. And then you have the Boxer Rebellion. Okay, why do we call it the Boxer Rebellion? So there was a group of people. They were known as the Boxers. Their actual name was the Righteous and Harmonious Fists. The Righteous and Harmonious Fists. They were basically, imagine, okay, so they gloried in their shadow boxing. Shadow boxing is basically when you look like you're boxing, but you're not actually boxing. And these guys, I don't know if they had gotten high on opium or something, but they had a lot of weird beliefs. It was almost a religion. And these boxers, among other things, believed that because of their training and because of their beliefs in the martial arts, they could be immune to bullets. So, with this in context, what happens? In America, a newspaper, I can't remember if it was in Chicago or New York, one, sat around the newspaper office one day, and they realized that there was no news to report. And if you're a newspaper, you always have to have news in order to pay the bills. And so one of them decided, hey, I'm just going to write a story, and it's going to be fake news. It's going to be completely fake. There's not going to be any truth to it, but it'll sell a lot of papers. So he wrote a story, and in that story, it talked about how the Army Corps of Engineers was going to invade China and break down the Great Wall of China to promote free trade among the nations. Because again, China was still resistant in trying to trade with other nations. And the Boxers heard about it. And again, the Boxers are a group of people. They're not really a political power. They're just basically a bunch of rebels who think they're immune to bullets. They would find out pretty quickly they weren't. But the Boxer Rebellion, these Boxers were actually very anti-foreigner. They were anti-American. And so when this gets to China, because again, the newspapers thought, oh, China will never find out. Well, guess what, dipstick? The wire service had just been invented. News traveled much faster now. And so China finds out about it. The Boxers find out about it. And whether or not they truly believed the Army Corps of Engineers was actually going to break down the wall of China, they saw it as a good reason, as a good way to get into a rebellion. So they lead a rebellion against the Chinese government, the Manchus. And they began killing American diplomats and American missionaries and English diplomats and English missionaries, pretty much anybody not Chinese. and those that harbored them. And so the Western powers, which included America, Britain, and all these other European powers who had people die in this rebellion, they jumped into the war. Anybody that says that America has never gone to war with China does not know about the Boxer Rebellion. We have gone to war with China. It was actually more on the... we weren't really on... we actually didn't fight the Chinese government in this case. We were fighting the rebels. But regardless, the Boxers lost the war. But even though the Boxers lost, the Manchu government proved itself so incapable of running a country that the 8-nation alliance, the 8 nations that invaded China, said, you know what, Manchus, you are too stupid to run a country. So we're going to throw you out of power and create a new government for you guys. It was a republic, and it was supposed to look somewhat like the U.S. That would exist until the 19-teens. And I can't remember exactly when that changed. I think it might have been actually in the 1950s when communism overthrew the republic. I'm pretty sure that's how it worked. But anyway, now that's been China. Let's get into Japan. Like I said, these Asian nations typically did not like outsiders, and they generally held their countries closed off to trade. Well, a guy by the name of Matthew Perry, he was a U.S. naval commander who sailed into Japanese waters with a small fleet of ships. He floats his fleet into Japanese waters, and he doesn't go to war with them. In fact, he goes there, and his goal was to persuade the Japanese royal family, which was the Tokugawa family, to allow trade between the U.S. and Japan. And amazingly enough, without any fighting, the Tokugawa family signed the Treaty of Kanagawa, which was the first treaty Japan ever signed with a Western nation, which allowed for trade with America. So you gotta imagine the fact that the Japanese royal family looked out onto the water and saw a fleet of ships in their harbor. That might have been part of the reason they agreed to sign, because they're like, if we don't sign it, they might actually start firing on us. So that might be a possibility. All right. Then after that, the Japanese go to war with Russia. This war has much to do with the War of Expansion, because it was Russia trying to expand into Japanese territories. However, as important as it is for this time period, it's even more important because it set the stage for Russia's involvement in World War I. Because Russia by the time World War I came, Russia had several PR disasters. One of them was they had lost a war in the Baltic states. They lost a war to the Japanese. And they just wanted to go to war with someone to prove that they were still relevant, to prove that they could still fight. And so they jumped into World War I, just basically to show the world, hey, we're still here, we can still fight, we're not old granny, we're actually a world power. So that has more to do with this coming chapter. Okay, now that should be it for today. We have a couple more pages. We're going to start talking about Africa next, and then we'll be going into the modern world. This will be Unit 567, Unit 7. So we are just breezing through this, and then we'll get into the Great War. We are on page 501. Well, we're not on page 501 now, but once we enter the new unit, we'll be on page 501, and this book, the actual work, ends on page number 620 something. So I feel confident we might be able to finish this by the end of the year. I'm confident, cautiously confident. So that's cool. Go ahead and continue doing your work, guys. Don't slack off. And here's a little note. Please, when you do your homework, I don't care if you do all of your homework on one page, but for heaven's sakes, please put your homework on actual notebook paper. Don't do your homework on the back of the assignment sheet. Do your homework on actual sheets of paper, lined sheets of paper that have 3 holes in it so you can put in a binder. That's the paper I want you to use. All right, with that being said, that's all the announcements from me. I just want you guys to know that I love you and I'm always praying for you.